People who are on the progressive side of politics in this country are all too often too ready to sacrifice winning, to sacrifice victory in the larger war against our adversaries in order to win a battle against our allies. We are all too frequently ready to sacrifice victory in the war against our adversary in order to win a battle against our allies. I've had my issues with unions. I've had grievances on my desk. But I can see the bigger picture. I know on 8 or 9 out of every 10 issues, we have common cause. And I have the ability to put my problems aside so that we can work in common cause. And so it's not a surprise to me at all. It's a surprise to me that it doesn't happen more often. It's part of why we get pummeled time after time after time. Because we are too ready to sacrifice that victory in the war against our adversaries in order to win a battle against our allies. So it's happy to be here. I'm happy to be here today with folks who I consider my allies on most issues. So we're here today because you guys have a ballot referendum, and I have some information that's relevant to the issue that referendum covers. So, a little bit about me. I am a Chicago principal. I was a teacher, and I've never forgotten that I was a teacher. I became an administrator. You know, when people talk about what should happen and what is, I think it's helpful to share some of your background so that people can see you have some kind of platform from which you're talking. So this is a little bit about what I've been able to do on the teams that I've been a part of. I was a part of the administration at Johnson Elementary School. And also, you know what? Let me say this too. I am not an ideologue, right? I don't stick with a position just because that's the position that I'm supposed to be taken by the group that I belong to. So let me tell you a little bit more about my history. I once paid $15,000 a year to send my son to private school. I no longer do that. I was once the principal of a private school. I once put in a proposal to start not one, but 2 charter schools. I was once a finalist for a principal position in a charter school. I was once part of the administration of a turnaround school, which you guys just talked about, where we didn't lose over half the staff that was there. Only 2 staff members remained. So I've shown a willingness to try anything to see what works. But after a while, you don't need to experiment anymore. You start noticing things. You start to see what works. And so I'm speaking from that position as someone who has tried it all, looked at the research, looked at what happens in other countries and thought something's not right with all of this. Am I making sense? Yes. All right. So this is one of the schools I was in as an assistant principal as part of the administration at Johnson. We came into Johnson, achievement was at 42% in terms of students meeting standards in reading. 42%. Johnson is an all-black school on the west side of Chicago. In just 2 short years, we got it up to 62%. I sure need my glasses. I'm like, what does that say? And that is, this is the reading about longer than mine. So this is what we were able to do in Johnson, right? This is math. Went up from 40-something%, 44, to almost 70. Now, this wasn't with different students, same students. After I left Johnson, I went on the other side of town, to the north side. Became principal of a school called Blaine, completely different. Johnson was all black, mostly poverty. Blaine was in one of the wealthiest communities in the city. A few blocks from Wrigley Field. This is what happened at Blaine. Before I got to Blaine, these are the years before, right here. These first 4 bars, you can see achievement had kind of leveled out. We got there, and we went from 79% meet standards to 89% meet standards. Now, what I would love to be able to say to you is, we went in with all these innovative ideas. That's the word now, innovation. We went in with all these innovative ideas, right? And that's what happened. But that would be a lie, right? This wasn't some hero, God complex coming in to save folks kind of thing. It wasn't innovation. We went in using basic evidence that's been shown and time after time after time to work in schools. We just looked at what works and did it. That was it. It was that simple. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, 2 stories I like to tell to make the point about evidence. One is a story about common sense. Now, if you all are teachers, and I remember being a teacher, and even as a principal, I still get this, where when you tell people what you do for a living, well, let me stop. If you're a doctor and you tell somebody what you do for a living, they don't start giving you advice. They ask for your advice. Y'all know where I'm going, right? You tell somebody you're a teacher and all you get is, well, this is what the schools need, and if only the schools had this. Everybody thinks they know. Like it's just common sense. And one of the stories I like to tell to make this point is a story when my son was 1 year old. He had a fever. Woke up in the middle of the night. His mom was, and she's like, go get a wet towel and put some lukewarm water on it. And I said, no. Put some cold water on it. Right? He's got a fever. The water should be cold. That's common sense, right?
Yes, it is.
Common sense. He's got a fever. He's hot. You want to put a cold compress on his head. Common sense. She said, no. Make it lukewarm. If you put a cold compress on his head, it's going to make it worse. I said, what are you talking about? Turns out, my common sense did not match with what the research had found out about how the body regulates temperature. If I had put that cold compress on his head, the research shows that the body has these temperature regulation mechanisms that when it feels that cold, it begins to have a response to produce heat. And my common sense, if I had applied it, would have made my son's fever worse and not better. And that's what we have in education today. Everybody coming in with their common sense, with their ideas that have nothing to do with what the evidence says works in education. Another story that I love to tell is the story of Kurt Hahn in the Gordonston School. It's in Scotland, if I remember correctly. The Prince Charles went there. His father, Philip, went there. And world-renowned school. And it had a benefactor, Prince Max of Germany. After he was German chancellor and retired, he would visit Gordonston, and he loved the school so much he would give tours of it. And one day he was giving a tour to an American. And the American said, what do you love most about this school? And Prince Max said, Look around. There's nothing original here. That's what I'm most proud of. We've stolen from everywhere. And the American says, but ought you not aim for originality? And Prince Max says, education, like medicine, is based on the wisdom of 1,000 years. You go to a doctor to get your appendix taken out, and if that doctor says, I'm going to take your appendix out in the most original manner possible, I highly recommend you go and see another doctor. And that's what we have in education. Everybody wanting to be original and innovative and completely losing the fact, hoping that we don't remember the fact that there's an evidence base we already have for what works. But if you know about that evidence base and you rely on it, then you don't need them and their charters and their privatization and their innovation, which is basically just an excuse to come in and try out anything on our children. They don't ask for innovation for their own children. They do what works. Ain't nothing wrong with innovation, but innovation has to be done on the foundation of what's already known. And that's not the kind of innovation they're talking about, right? I know y'all wonder, what does all this have to do with charter schools? So I'm talking about the evidence. This is what the evidence says about what works. There's two main strands. What impacts student performance? One, students' baseline attainment is influenced heavily by the income level of their parents. Heavily. Now, it's not like, well, my parents don't make a lot of money, so I can't learn. That doesn't make any sense. But money influences access to things that do determine whether or not and how much you learn. Like access to prenatal care. You're less likely to get when you don't have the income. Like early parent talk in a rich linguistic environment. We found that that's less rich in households that have moderate or less than moderate income. It's not universal. You can find some low-income households with lots of rich language. But in terms of the odds, exposure to lead paint, you're more likely to be exposed to that when you don't have adequate income to get decent housing. And then that influences your cognitive development. As a matter of fact, in Chicago, if you live in Lincoln Park, nice well-to-do community, you have a 0% chance of being exposed to lead paint. If you live in Austin on the west side, you know what your chances are? 1 in 4. And so that means the schools in Austin have to deal with something entirely different than what the schools in Lincoln Park deal with. Are you all hearing me? Yes. And so when we talk about the impact of income, we have to stop saying poverty, because that's easy to dismiss. We have, what levers does poverty pull? It pulls the level of prenatal care, parent talk, exposure to lead paint, access to decent health care, access to decent nutrition, exposure to violence that can impact your cognitive development. Right? We have to talk about the specifics, because you can't dismiss those. We have to be careful about how we talk about these influences. So baseline attainment is influenced by income. But you also have academic growth. So no matter how kids come to us, we can help them to grow academically. Right? That's on us. However they come, if they come 2 years behind, or if they come in 3rd grade at a 1st grade level, by the time they're in 4th grade, they better at least be at a 2nd grade level. You better get them to grow at least a year. It'd be nice if we could do more, but at least have them grow. Am I making sense? Yes. So that's on us. Now, that growth is still heavily influenced by these things too. But we have to make that effort. And it's been shown it can be done. Now, I've seen this as principal and assistant principal at Johnson and Blaine. When I was at Johnson, the kids would come into kindergarten 1, 2, 3 years behind the kids who were at Blaine. How is that a failing school and the gap is there on day 1? How is that a failing school school and the gap is there on day one. Those children have been failed long before they ever reached a classroom. Failed by their alderman, failed by their city councilman, failed by their state rep, failed by their mayor, failed by the business community. And we have to address that failure. We have to hold them accountable. I would say a lot more, but I don't have a lot of time, and I still got to get the charges. I'm like, what are you talking about? I thought this was going to be about charges. Here's another demonstration of income. The color represents an income band. These are all the schools in Illinois. All of them. And so this green represents all the schools with 87% or more poverty. This purple represents schools with 75% or more poverty. This orangish red line represents schools with 62% or more poverty, 50%, and on and on. So the colors show the poverty level. Over 10 years, it tracks their achievement of the schools, of the average achievement. And if you notice, there is at no point a time in which the poverty level of a school, one school who's at a lower end of the income band, exceeds the achievement of a school that's in a higher income band. It's one of the most powerful statements about the impact of access to adequate income on student achievement. Like the lines never cross, ever. But there is one instance where it looks like they might. We're going to get to that later. That was high school. This is the same thing in elementary. Now, what does the influence of income on student achievement have to do with charter schools? Why am I talking about this? So I'm going to do a micro and a macro. This is your micro right here. These are two schools in Chicago. Neighborhood and a charter. They're both high schools. They're darn near next door to each other. The average, now what charters like to say is, well, we have low-income students too. We have students from poverty too. You know, but there's a big band in poverty, right? You can make $50,000 a year and still qualify for reduced lunch and be technically considered in poverty. Or low income, excuse me, not poverty, technically considered low income. You get up, absolutely, $0 per year. Now, knowing what we know about the influence of income on kids' access to things that stimulate cognitive development, who would you bet your money on in terms of the higher achieving student? Who's going to have the greatest possibility of being a high achiever? The kid from the household that has 50 grand a year, or the one that makes nothing? Like, we all know what the reality is. We all also know that it's possible for something else to happen, but we know what the odds are. We know what the reality is in America. And the charter schools know the reality too. And so they have an enrollment system that increases the likelihood that they're going to get the children who are in low-income households, but they're making the high end of low income, while the neighborhood schools get students who are making the low end of low income. And this is exactly what we see here. The median income at the charter is $25,000. This is Chicago and Bronzeville. The median income at the public is $5,000. So that public school is dealing with things that charter school doesn't have to deal with. Unemployment at the charter and the parents is 31%. Unemployment at the neighborhood school is 75%. They're more likely, I don't have the exact numbers on this, but they're more likely, the study states, to have a car. The parents are more likely to have a car in the charter and more likely to be regular attendees at church. So there's a stability of environment So they have this huge advantage. They should be outperforming us. That's a micro level. Here's a macro level. This is a study done out of New Jersey because Illinois makes the data almost impossible to get. So this is the difference between free lunch and reduced lunch. Again, you can make $50,000 a year and qualify for reduced lunch. Free lunch, again, you can make $5,000. Right? That's a completely different thing. So how are free and reduced lunch children spread over public and charter schools in New Jersey? What this shows is that the further on the right you are, the more students you have who are eligible for free lunch. The further on the left, the more you have, the less you have available or eligible for free lunch. Charters are red. So who has fewer free lunch students? They're down here, fewer free lunch students. Now let's go to reduced price lunch. So the schools with more reduced students are on the right. And what do you see over there? You see the charters. So they have an enrollment system. And the enrollment system, you all are familiar with it, right? It's a lottery-based system. You enter your kid in a lottery, and you get a list of schools they've been accepted to, you pick one. How does that cherry pick? Well, charters have automatically guaranteed by virtue of their enrollment process that they will never get a parent who is not involved enough to fill out an application for their kid. Anyone who doesn't even, that they automatically exclude that population that won't even engage, that may not even know about it. And then they have some other practices that we'll look at. So, are we seeing the relationship between income? I'm talking about income and charters. So here's our finding. Charters create hyper-segregation. Charters get students from low-income families. Public schools get students from the lowest income families. Why does this matter? That's why it matters. Because that income heavily influences achievement. Now, that leaves us with a question. How do we determine the relative effectiveness of public versus charter schools when charters enroll students from high-income families? So, how do you tell where the good teaching is happening? Well, I have two answers to that. First, compare them to public schools that have the same lottery enrollment process. In Chicago, they're called magnet schools. Exact same process. Parents fill out an app, it's a lottery, they get in. So don't compare the charters to the neighborhoods. Compare them to other public schools that have that same advantage. And in Chicago, when you look at student achievement data, you mean to tell me that you have all that advantage, and not only do you not measure up to the magnets, you don't even measure up to the neighborhoods. And what they like to say is, well, charters, they have similar achievement for neighborhood schools, but they do it at much less cost. Right? But when you compare them to what you're supposed to compare them to, you see the achievement is lacking. Right? So that's one way you do it. Second way you do it, instead of comparing attainment scores, compare how much students grow academically over the course of a year. In Chicago, we have a mechanism for that. It's called the MAP assessment. It's a national standardized test. And it measures students in 1 year, they take the test and they get a RIT score. The next year they take it again and get another RIT score, and their growth is the difference between the two scores. So it measures student learning over an entire academic year. That's pretty significant. And it gives students a score, a percentile, and it only compares them to students who scored what they scored. Because growth, if I score like a 200 and another kid scores a 250, the next year the kid at 200 gains 10 points and this kid gains 5 points, you can't really compare them because they're different levels. It only compares you to students who scored what you scored. Am I making sense? Yes. All right. What does this assessment say in Chicago? So what I did, I took the data district-wide, because the district didn't do this analysis, of course. I took the data, did my analysis, gave it to the Sun-Times, Chicago Sun-Times. They verified my analysis. Numbers were slightly different, but the same conclusion.
Did they publish it?
Yes, they did. So, this is the attainment. Remember, the map also does attainment. It does attainment and growth. So this was attainment. Again, it looks like charters in neighborhood schools do about the same. But what happens when we look at the growth percentiles? There you go. Neighborhood schools are at the 75th percentile, while charter schools are less than the 50th. And so they're recruiting students who can get attainment comparable to the public schools, but what do they do with those students? Nothing. Now, let's look at it neighborhood by neighborhood, right? Here's a neighborhood in Chicago, the North River Commission Service area, which encompasses Albany Park and Rogers Park. These are attainment scores. And so the two highlighted ones are charters, right? You have CICS charter, they got the 93rd percentile. Wow, they're really doing great. Their students are really scoring high. And then you got, what is this, Aspira? They're at the 40th. And so they're distributed throughout. So it looks like the narrative that the charter folks like to put out there is true. Some charters are doing well, so they do about what neighborhood schools do. You got neighborhood schools down here, you got charter schools up here. But what happens when we look at growth? What do those students learn in the course of an academic year? Dead last. Dead last. Most schools. Let's take a look at another neighborhood in Chicago. That's the north side. Let's go over to the south side in West Pullman and Argyle Gardens. Once again, you have the three charters throughout the distribution. Some on the low end, middle, and high end. Well, almost high end. Right? But what happens when we look at how those students grow academically? All three dead last. And it's important for us to remember in this system of choice, right? There's supposed to be that parent trigger. The parent's not happy, they'll take their child out and put them in a better school. We got to remember that parents chose to put their children in these schools. That they took their children out of these schools because their attainment scores might have been low. Not realizing the difference between attainment and growth. Here's another Southside neighborhood, Chatham. We have one charter, it's Shabazz. And again, all of the attainment in this area is pretty low. All right, this is a depressed, low-income area. What happens when we look at growth? Once again, dead last. Now, these are a bunch of neighborhood schools, no charters here. They're all neighborhood schools throughout Chicago. And as you can see, their attainment is pretty low. These are the kinds of schools they want to close. And I need you all to hear this, Boston, because you have schools just like this that they want to close. Based on attainment scores, based on scores that are more a result of a failure that took place long before they ever reached the school. But what are these schools doing with these kids? Now I'm going to show you the growth scores for the exact same schools. Oh, sorry. And so these children are learning 99th percentile, 92nd, 97th, 95th, 94th, 82nd. The schools are getting them, and they have low attainment. They probably showed up like those kids at Johnson on day one, but every year they grow. These schools are doing more with these children than a charter school or a private school ever could. But all they're looking at is this. And then shutting these schools down in order to send them to schools like this. Are we understanding this? Yes. Now I'm going to bridge this. This is another piece. These are the 45 highest growth schools in Chicago, right here. All 99th percentile. These are the lowest growth schools. You notice there are no charters here. Every single one is public. Over here, over half are charter for turnaround. That charters and turnaround don't make up half our district. A little bit over 15%. And you mean to tell me you make up only 15% of the district, but when it comes to the lowest growth schools in terms of academic performance, you make up over half? Something is wrong here. Government has whether parents deserve choices is irrelevant or far less relevant than the fact that government has no business subsidizing a model for schooling that produces poor options for parents to choose from. Now, let's bridge this to the achievement gap. You notice the achievement gap isn't talked about much anymore? Remember when they started this movement, it was all about the gap. Now they don't mention the gap anymore. There's a reason for that. Now, there's some logic here. Now, we all know the achievement gap. You got whites and Asian students here. You have black and Latino students here, right? Now, increasingly, black and Latino students are being funneled or encouraged or promoted to go into the charter system. Right? We know who's in charters. Now, if the charter system was better, producing more learning, then the gap would shrink. If the charter system was just as good as the public system, the gap would remain the same. If the charter system was producing far less academic growth in these students, then the gap would increase. Right? We have to test our theories out, right? We have to ask questions like this. We have to be scientific. Now, what do we think happened to that gap in Chicago, where charters proliferated? This is 2011. CPS fails to close performance gaps. Black students still losing academic ground despite reforms. Studied at the University of Chicago. 2 years later, 2013, test score gap widens between white and black students in Chicago. 2 years later, 2015, racial gap widens again as some elementary math reading scores improve. The gap keeps getting wider. How is it possible for a huge majority or huge proportion of your black and brown students to be going into a system that's supposed to be better and the gap gets wider? When you take that and combine it with the growth data, it affirms that narrative. Something is wrong here. And any sensible public servant would say, stop! We have to check this out. We have to take another look at what we're doing. Now, that's just Chicago. Let's look around the country, though. Maybe Chicago's different. Maybe the charter model there isn't quite the same. Actually, it is. But, we have to be scientific. We have to do our due diligence. And so, what state was ground zero for charters? Somebody remember? It was a northern state just above Illinois. I remember Milwaukee, charters and vouchers. That's where it all got started. Now it's rampant. And so once again, we don't have to ask the question. We don't have to wonder anymore. The data is there. Right? If those students were going to better options, that gap would decrease. Now, what do you think happened? Actually, let me rephrase it. What state in the United States now has the largest achievement gap in the nation? Wisconsin's achievement gap, academic achievement gap, remains nation's widest. Here's another look at it. These are the gaps of like the top dozen or so, the worst dozen or so in terms of achievement gap. You got Wisconsin, Massachusetts, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio, everywhere. In these places that charters are proliferating, the achievement of black and brown children is getting worse and worse in relationship to the achievement of white and Asian students. This one is about black and white. There's a site where you can go and actually play with these buttons up here and compare different groups. It's out of a newspaper in Connecticut that pulled this together from National Assessment of Educational Progress data. So, but you know, there's also a city where charters are like half of the district. But that city doesn't belong to any state. D.C., that's right. So if D.C. were a state, guess what? Look at their gap. Look at that. Look at it. This is what we're doing to black and brown children with this model for schooling. The widest by far. And no one's talking about it. So, we have the fact that they are getting a poor quality education in charge, on average. Now, that might be some good ones. I'm sure there are. But there might be some exceptions. But exceptions don't create good school systems. Critical mass creates good school systems. And this model does not come anywhere near to producing the critical mass of good schools needed to create a good system. Government has no business supporting a model for schooling where 9 out of every 10 of the new schools can't even beat the average of the schools in existence. And again, this is not against charter educators. This ain't against parents who send your kids to charters. You need this information. Right? People out there trying to do their best. They're working with whatever information they have. They're trying to send their kids to where they believe they'll be safe, where they believe they'll get an education. I'm sure the teachers in those schools work just as hard. But there's something about that model that does not work. And we have to get to those things. That's important. Again, when I talk about poverty, we have to figure out what the levers are and talk about those levers. It's the same thing with charters. It can't be an anti-charter thing. We have to talk about what makes them, those things that make them toxic to our system, and get rid of those things. You get rid of those things, we won't have to worry about charters. The only people who want to engage in a charter are people who actually have good, who want our kids, who actually want to do the right thing about it. So, another aspect of charters is that they expel at rates that are, I don't even know how to, I'll just talk about the data out of Chicago. The Principals Association just did this study using CPS data. So, public schools, the average expulsion rate is 0.02%. So you would have to divide a child up into 50 pieces. And that's how many students per 100 that public schools expel per year. The charter school percentage is 0.1, 5 times higher. But when you look at the chains, the big charter chains, it's way more than 5 times higher. You look at urban prep, 1.65 per 100, that's 83 times as high. Not 83% higher, 83 times higher. You look at their West Campus, 1.9 per 100. 95 times higher. Not 95% higher, 95 times higher. Urban Prep West. Urban Prep West, we got Noble Hansberry, 158 times higher. Noble Johnson, 163 times higher. Noble Baker, 251 times higher. Not 251% higher. 251. If I were to express that, just as an academic exercise, if I were to express that as a percentage, that would be 25,000% higher. Can you even say that? Is that even like proper to say 25,000%? Like, I've never heard it before. And that's just the students they expel. We're not even talking about the ones they push out or they threaten or that you're not going to get this class if you stay here, you better, or you won't graduate because we won't allow you to take the class. Right? We're not even counting those. Right? When I expelled students when I was a public school assistant principal. And I always felt like I failed kids when I expelled them. Like, there was something I felt like a failure. Something we could have done, should have done, but we didn't. And if you look at expulsions as failures, then these schools are failing at 25,000% higher rates than public schools. And so you all can't let this proliferate in Boston. Check my time. Looks like I got 15 minutes. So, and in Chicago, these schools, and we have a chart I don't have here, in Chicago, these schools get to keep the money for the students after they expel them. They have a thing we call the 20th day purge. At the 20th day of school, they calculate your budget, and that's what you get for the year. Right after the 20th day, the charter purge begins. And public schools get the students, but don't get the money that's supposed to go with them. We calculated this for Noble Street. We calculated, this is misappropriation of funds. Again, we got to be careful about our language, right? We have to use language that'll call attention to the problem and make it as urgent. This is misappropriation on a massive scale. We calculated the funds for Noble Street, and again, it's just the expulsions, not all the council levels. And they are getting nearly $1 million per year for students they did not want. $1 million per year for students they expelled. $1 million per year for students they failed and sent back to the schools where they could actually get an education. Because that's what you're saying when you expel kids like that. We don't know how to deal with you. We're going to send you to the folks that do. We don't know how to teach you. We're going to send you to the folks that do. We don't have the expertise here. We're going to send you to where they're trained for that. And then you do it without the funds. Y'all can't let that happen here in Boston any more than it already is, and we have to undo what's being done. You know, I don't take this defeatist attitude. This has to stop. It's inevitable. It's inevitable if you let it happen. It's not inevitable that you will remain sitting still. And so, why is achievement in charter so poor? Right? There's a couple of ideas. Compensation and working conditions were not attracting and retaining critical mass of skilled teachers. And again, you have exceptions. You got that teacher but again, exceptions don't create great schools. Critical mass does. And we have the kind of teacher churn that happens in the charter where you can't even stay, average person can't even stay to the 5th year, which is where you get into your zone. It's no wonder what's happening in charters is happening in charters, right? When the model for the school is based on profit and a need to take resources away from the things that matter, like teachers, and send them to the bank account of some charter management organization. No wonder they're getting the results that they have. You know, I heard there's this thing, and they are so good with their language, right? That they go in Chicago, well, you know, if we didn't have to pay the teacher pensions, if we didn't have to pay teachers so much, we could invest in the classroom. That's like saying, well, we have Boston, that's like the Boston Celtics owner saying, if we didn't have to pay the players so much, we could invest in getting a good team. How else do you get a good team? What else are you going to spend the money on? How much does a basketball cost? The greatest resource you can have for a child is you in a school. And you better have a compensation package that brings you in and keeps you there. Any other ideas about what may have caused this that I don't have here? It's a real question.
Greed. Greed.
That's number 2.
And union busting.
Busting unions, but when I say, I should have made my question more specific, the low achievement. What's causing that low achievement besides this?
The haves versus the have-nots.
Like prison.
Yes.
Segregation.
The have versus the have-nots.
All right. I normally get a little more out of this participation, but I got to keep going. So, here's my summary. These are 5 major problems with charters. And these are the things we have to talk about. 1, there's a lack of oversight and transparency. You can't have another one until that gets fixed. There's a diversion of funds that incentivizes robbing funds from students, taking funds that could go to students so that folks can profit. The profit motive has to be removed. You know, this whole thing where the nonprofits get around the rule for having to be a nonprofit by hiring a for-profit company to manage it for them has to be eliminated. They're failing students through expulsions. That has to get dealt with. It has to end. The hyper-segregation, where not only are we segregated by race now, but within a race we're separated by income. With the folks in extreme poverty concentrated in one school and the folks in moderate poverty in another. That must end. We cannot have enrollment systems like that. And this idea, we have to look at the academic growth of students in charters. And unless that changes, there can't be another charter. And we have to start reintegrating charters into district management. I don't say close them. Again, you gotta be careful with your language. I wouldn't close a school. But your school needs to be reintegrated into district management. That charter company, that charter management company, we gotta get rid of them and have an organization manage your school that doesn't have that profit motive to take resources away from your child. We have to put a compensation system in place at your school that'll attract and retain good teachers. Because right now, the one you have, we have to reintegrate you in a district manager. Now, it's interesting, these 4 pillars that I found, because they look eerily similar to this. One of the things I love about what the NAACP did, they called for a moratorium on charters, but they did it with 4 specific conditions. You have to address these things. They said, we are calling for a moratorium on the expansion of the charter schools, at least until such time as charter schools are subject to the same transparency and accountability standards as public schools. Public funds are not diverted to charter schools at the expense of the public school system. Charter schools cease expelling students that public schools have a duty to educate, and seeks to perpetuate de facto segregation of the highest performing children from those whose aspirations may be high, but whose talents are not yet as obvious. That's what has to get emphasized in the debate. There's an alderman in Chicago, his name is Rick Munoz, and I love this man. When I met him for the first time, he said, I don't have a problem with charters. If they want to come into my ward, I said, sure. I just give them 2 conditions. I say, number 1, you have to allow your employees to bargain collectively for salary and working conditions. And number 2, you have to take an attendance boundary. Right? You don't get to cherry pick. You get a boundary and you take those kids and see what you can do with them. And he said, you know what? They never take me up on my offer. I don't know why. Right, but that's an example of someone who understands the power of language and how you frame your response to charters. He went right toward the 2 most significant factors that make them toxic. You got this? Oh. I think I'll open it up for questions now. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. It's just fantastic. When you arrived, you talked about the irony of being a principal in a teachers union meeting, and Richard alluded to how important your voice is. In Massachusetts, principals are forbidden by state law from organizing a union, and I think many of us have had experiences where we've talked to principals we know one-on-one, and they say things that we know are true and they know are true, but they are scared, reasonably, to say them in public. And I'm wondering if you have any advice for helping us get our principals and school leaders to raise their voice, because many of them see the same things we do, but they're afraid to say it because they're afraid to do it.
So, the question was about principals speaking up and any advice to help the principals. We have help the principals in Boston speak up. We have the same problem in Chicago. Unfortunately, I am an anomaly. For those who know, I spoke out for 3 years before they finally came in and removed me. But one of the things that enabled me to stay for so long was the community that I served at Blaine. A well-to-do community that appreciated what I brought. I had good, y'all saw the results that we were able to get. And so, I'm going to answer that a couple of ways. The principals have to begin to connect with the parents, right? I was at a meeting with an organization called Raise Your Hand the other day, right? And they were like, this is a North Side group, mostly white, and they're like, we need some inroads in the West Side. We need to figure out how to get a reach into the South Side. Well, I said, I know all the West Side principals. I know all the South Side principals. What would happen if I was able, they know, and those principals know who the active parents are, who could benefit from connecting with groups like Raise Your Hand and putting their energy into the same issues that those groups address, right? Imagine, for example, there's a piece of legislation in the city council. We have to pull the right lever to get it passed. But we know these 10 aldermen, I can hear you call them councilmen, these 10 aldermen are against it. What schools are in those aldermen's wards? All right, let's go on the phone to those principals. Let's organize those parents. And let's get those parents calling that alderman's office, marching to his office, going door to door in that alderman's ward with petitions. You scare them real when you start going door to door in that ward. They get scared then. So it's an example of the power principals can have in being that connecting force And in getting those parents connected with those citywide issues and mobilizing around them, you then build a power base that can protect you. Am I making sense here? So that's a short answer. I mean, I've been doing a lot of thinking about this, but I want to give somebody else a chance. But I hope that gives a sense. Like, if you don't connect, the people that politicians are scared of are voters. And if, as principals and teachers, we don't connect with the residents and voters, we don't stand a chance, right? We're dealing with the power of organized money, and the only thing that will beat it is the power of organized people. And so we have to contribute to that organization. Does that help? Any others? Yes, ma'am.
Would you address how charter schools do not educate the children with severe disabilities? And if they really have the best interest of all students at heart, why don't they create charter schools to find the best innovative and to help the kids with the most severe disabilities, like the kids with autism, multiple disabilities, medically involved?
So again, that's another practice that needs to be on that list, right? Because again, one of the things I'm concerned about is that all charters are not toxic. There are some real nonprofit ones in Chicago that care. I've met with them, I've talked with them. And so I like to focus on these things, to say these things have to get addressed. And that's one of them. And I think, in short, for those charters that are toxic, that reality exists because paid kids are expensive. And if you have a model for profit, you don't want to take on kids who are expensive. It's that simple. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I feel like every day, actually, I'm in a battle with parents around like the decision that they make to send their kids to charters. My kids are in charter, so I'm obviously not against charter. I was very thoughtful about the choice I make to send them to a charter. But my question is, how do you help parents actually see that their kids are not, quote unquote, learning more than charter? Because that's an argument I get a lot. Well, my kid is doing this and they're basing it off of homework that is sent home. I can go and copy a page. Any teacher can. Or the fact that they're like, well, they're doing this and this test and all of that. I feel like I'm in a battle constantly with parents instead of helping them to understand the bigger picture. And with the slides that you show around the growth, like, I need to be armed with that so that I can go out and then be like, hey, this is what is happening. Yes, they're scoring well on tests, but they're not really learning more than the kids in my classroom or the kids in the classroom next down the street. So it's like, how do I fight that as a person, as a parent, and as a parent who have children in charter schools?
Thank you so much. I think you just answered half of it while you were talking to me. I got to get this in. Like, one, we have to be armed with the right information, like what you said, right? But two, we have to be careful about what fights we get ourselves in, right? The people who are pushing this are successful because they proactively created a narrative, right? They got their talking points, and they repeat them over and over and over and over again, right? That parent sends their child knowingly to that school because they've heard the talking points over and over and over and over. They say the same line repeatedly. And they've chosen really good language too. Choice. Who can argue with choice? Right? We have to have the same approach. Right? Because that little argument that we have on the side with a parent, they'll hear that argument one time. Y'all hear me? They'll hear that argument one time with you. Unless that's your girl and y'all talk, every other day. But what we have to do is begin to create a narrative and repeat it. And do it as well, as efficiently, and as relentlessly as they do. Does that answer the question? So, one, the direct answer is be armed with information, get your talking points straight, And, but that one so part two, that one conversation isn't gonna have the kind of impact that hearing the same thing over and over and over again will, if it's well-constructed language delivered for impact. I hope that makes sense. Yes, ma'am? Wait, hold on. Okay, this is the last question.
I don't have a question, I have a comment.
Okay, this is the last comment.
See, I should have been allowed to make the commercial for No 1 too. Because what I would have said was, if Citizens for Public Schools and all the groups that are pro-charter, if they really cared, instead of spending the billions of dollars that they're spending on making these commercials to defeat us, if they would just put it in the schools and stop stealing our dollars, we wouldn't have a problem with you.
I think you meant to say Families for Excellent Schools. Citizens for Public Schools is actually with us. Yeah, they're with us.
You
They're
know
great
what?
allies.
If you would take the money that you're spending on all these commercials and actually fund your schools with it, stop pulling our dollars, we wouldn't have a problem with it.
So I think that's a good place to end because, I mean, that's what this is about. We have to see the connection of this movement to other movements against working people across this country, right? That the same forces that privatize, or the same strand of movement on the part of the wealthy that privatize Chicago's parking meters, it's the same strand that trying to privatize our school system with charters and vouchers. Right? There is a movement to extract public wealth from serving the public and to send that wealth to private hands. And if we don't see that connection, if we think our charters is the problem, they'll come up with a new way to extract wealth. We have to see that and we have to defeat it, and I believe we will. We can and we will. So thank you all for listening. I appreciate it.
Let's hear it. This is terrific. Thank you very, very much.